Me and two friends had set up camp near a state park so we could hunt for elk. Early in the morning, all of us guys were talking around the fire and getting ready to eat breakfast. After breakfast, we all got up and got ready to head down the popular game trail to one of our many stands. It was early in the morning, and the weather was beautiful. I remember the morning so well. The sky was blue, and there were even a few clouds in the sky. The sun was out, and the water over the pond was sparkling and clear. Birds were singing in the trees, and a squirrel would occasionally jump from branch to branch. There were also green leaves swaying in the wind that had just started to turn yellow and gold from fall. We had been walking through the woods for about an hour before we heard a sound. It sounded like someone else's voice murmuring in the trees and over the water. We all looked at each other, slowed down, and listened carefully. It would stop then. We kept walking in silence for a few more minutes before we heard it again. We can't be sure if the sounds came from the left, the right, the front, the back, the top, or the bottom. It seemed to be coming from every direction. This time, it was clearer and started to sound like someone was whispering or mumbling in a foreign language. We didn't know why, but as we walked, the sounds got louder and the murmuring started to sound angry. Then the birds stopped singing, and every now and then we could still hear that strange language being spoken deep in these woods. All four of us were starting to sweat because we were so scared. I could see that the other guys were getting very uncomfortable, but we kept walking toward our stand. We're now about 2 hours in. When we got to our first stand, my friend Scott stopped us and looked down at the ground. There was a big footprint that we didn't recognize. It was strange and named Claude. You could see what looked like 3 toes with big claws on each one if you looked. From the mark in the dirt, it must have weighed at least 400 to 500 pounds. We didn't see a second print with it, we only saw one step. We all looked at each other and thought, is this really happening? What could leave a mark like that? A bear? No, not that far down. The claws were very big. It was unlike anything we had ever seen. We all agreed that it would be best to move a little further into the trees and brush up over a hill in the distance to get to the second stand. This made things very strange. As we walked up the hill, the sun was just beginning to come up. The trees around us were very, very close together, so we couldn't see very far. We had been talking about what that print most likely was for another hour. My friend Joe stopped and yelled loudly. He was going to say something. As we all looked where he was pointing, up in the trees, we saw the scariest thing I've ever seen. It was a few feet tall and stuck to the trees like a strange natural phenomenon. It looked like a spider or something, but it was also very clearly a person. It looked at us and gave us this horrifying grin. It made me think of what would happen if you crossed a person and a spider. I can't even explain it. He just yelled, "Run!" And we turned and ran as fast as we could. This thing behind us made a sound like nothing else. We ran as fast as we could with all our gear on, and now we're dragging it back the way we came. After about 10 minutes, we stopped to try to catch our breath, and the rest of the way back to camp was quiet. Nobody said a word. This thing didn't sound like it was following us, but we didn't stop until we got back to camp, which was a few miles away. We were not going to be hunted that day. When we got back to camp, we could hear this loud, scary howling coming from the area behind the other side of the lake. We never went back to our stands, and we haven't told anyone about this because we were afraid. I'm wondering if anyone else has seen or heard something similar and would like to talk about it. We'd love to hear your ideas. We might be able to figure out what went on that day. I don't usually like talking about things like this, but I can't deny what happened on this day in September 2013. First of all, I wouldn't say I'm a big fan of the outdoors, but I do enjoy camping and hiking a lot. I'd like to think that I'm in pretty good shape. I use the elliptical and the treadmill to stay as fit as possible. When I'm not hiking, I enjoy being able to hike 5 to 10 miles at a time. So I try to stay in great shape, even though by many measures I'm not even close. But I hope you understand what I mean, because my friend is the same way, and we often go hiking together. We've gone hiking in a lot of places and done a lot of things. So the story I'm about to tell you is the only time we've ever seen something strange that we couldn't explain. I also said that the story says we've never seen strange tracks, a Bigfoot, or anything like that. We've also never seen a UFO or anything like that. Even though I've heard of a lot of strange things like this from people who saw them, I've never seen one myself. But what I'm about to tell you is definitely in that category. Okay, so we had just set up a camp and started a fire. He had just finished setting up his tent, and I was sitting there taking out the beef jerky. We were talking about something I can't remember, and he looked off into the distance with a strange look on his face and asked, "Hey, what kind of animal is that?" We both look over, and in the distance, we see a long, white figure running down a hill. Now, just a quick note, all around us is thick forest. To our right, the land dips down in a small hill to a small creek. Here is where our water comes from. The land then goes back up a bigger hill, where there is more wood between us. The creek and the other part of the woods are a large clearing or meadow. There are a few trees here and there, but it's mostly open, and as we were setting up camp that morning, a big bull elk was just sitting out there. It's quite beautiful. So when this thing walks out into the clearing, it stands out against the bright green grass like a sore thumb. And I think that when my friend finally saw it, he pointed to it, and when I looked, I saw this weird thing that made me think, what the? I stood up to get a better look, and now my friend and I are just staring at it. I'll try to explain it as best I can. It was like a person walking on all fours, but their arms and legs were really long and they were completely naked. It looked weird, and the way it walked was like if someone had crab legs. It was very, very strange. We see it walk from one part of the clearing to the middle, where it stops and sits as still as a statue. Then it turns and walks into the northern part of the clearing. Then it disappeared. We kind of just looked at each other, trying to figure out what we had just seen, but none of us really knew. It didn't scare us as much as it made us wonder what was going on. Even though we talked about it for about 20 minutes, we kind of forgot about it and went on with our day. We never went through anything like this again. I have a pretty scary story to tell. My boyfriend and I went camping a few years ago, and we are still together. When we got to our campsite, we set up everything, and the night went pretty smoothly. But right before we went to sleep, my boyfriend and I got into a very big, very heated fight. He walked out of the tent in a rage and told me, "Fine, I'll just sleep in the truck." We were both so angry with each other. I thought, whatever, that's fine. So I slept in the tent, which was nice, but it wasn't cold outside. This happened at the end of June, so it was pretty warm. I think he just put something down on the seat. I don't know, and I don't care much. I woke up around 1:30 a.m., looked at my phone, and felt like something was wrong. I probably should go see how he is. Maybe I just felt sorry for the guy in some way. I'm not sure. When I get out of my sleeping bag and go outside, the cap light is already on. That's weird. I go up to the window and knock on it, but something is wrong. He's shaking and his eyes are wide. He's also very pale. I open the door and ask, "What's going on? Are you okay?" And he turns slowly toward me. The guy looks like he just saw a tornado. He gives a head shake. No, and it was clear that he was scared of something. He quickly grabs me, pulls me close to the door of the truck's cab, and locks the door. Now, I'm getting more and more worried. What happened? Why are you going crazy? He stops and looks at me again. I've never seen him this scared before, and he's still shaking. He asked if it was outside. I didn't see it. I'm saying, what are you talking about? What do you mean? Does it exist? I don't understand what you're saying. He covers my mouth with his finger and says, "Listen, I couldn't hear anything." He says that there are no crickets or anything else. So I tell him, "You're starting to scare me. What's up?" He doesn't say anything, though. He just makes it stay quiet. After maybe 30 seconds, he jumps over me, pushes me into the passenger seat, starts the truck, and the headlights come on. He turns the car on and drives away, and I wonder, what are you doing? Are you crazy? We can't just leave all of our supplies back there, and he's not saying anything. He drives maybe 5 or 6 miles, then stops the car in the middle of the road, puts it in park, and just sits there. He slowly turns toward me and says, "The most convoys, there's something." I don't know what it was. A skeleton or something else tried to get into the truck by tapping on the glass and pulling on the cab doors. I'm thinking to myself, okay, something is obviously scaring you. Maybe you had a bad dream. But he became very emotional and irrational right away. He said, "No, this isn't a dream. This thing looked like a demon, not a bear, wolf, dog, raccoon, fox, or anything else. It was trying to get inside the truck's cab." My boyfriend doesn't usually play jokes on me or make up stories like this. He was really scared to death. I mean that the man was white and shaking. You can see the real fear running through him. Like a very raw feeling. I didn't know what to say or do, but I did my best to make him feel better. It was clear that he had seen something scary. I didn't say anything for a while and just waited. After maybe a couple of minutes, I asked him if he wanted to go to a hotel, which is what we did. We went back in the morning when it was light out and got all of our stuff, including our tent. That was the end of our camping trip, and it was still by far the scariest thing I could ever think of. Even so, he doesn't like to talk about it or answer questions about it now if I ask him about it. So I still don't know for sure what he saw, but whatever it was, it clearly scared him. I had gone camping with my family on Forest Road 1820, near Little Deer Creek. This is also right in the Skagit Valley area of Finney Creek. In the spring of 2011, this happened. Now, where I was is surrounded by a lot of forest on all sides. It has thick cedar and fir trees, as well as some older trees. I've been here several times and fished for trout many times in the same area. This is also a great place to go fishing. But as I walked past a part of a small bridge that crosses the creek, I had the feeling that I wasn't alone. We were all together, but they weren't. They were back at camp after the short hike. I was all by myself. But I could tell that there was something else with me in the woods. I'm not going to say that it was a monster, but maybe someone was following me. I'm not sure. You know that feeling in the pit of your stomach when you think something bad is going to happen. So, that was what it was. And the first thing that came to mind was that I was going to be attacked and killed out here, that some crazy murderer, with an axe was hiding behind the trees, waiting for the right time to strike. I kept looking around but didn't find anything, so I kind of brushed it off and decided it would be best for me to go back to camp. I was only about 3 miles from camp, so even though it was spring, I walked the whole way very quickly. On this day, it was very hot. Like many days, I do my best to stay safe by following the creek. I don't know if following the creek automatically makes you safer, but it made me feel safer because I think the creek will always lead you to the right place if something goes wrong. I always knew that once I got back to my camp, the feelings would go away, and I didn't go anywhere alone for the rest of that trip. I've never been alone in the woods and felt like I wasn't alone. Maybe it was just a feeling. Always go with what you feel in your gut. 4 Boy Scouts on a backpacking trip in Wyoming's Wind River Range were exploring the shores of Junction Lake at dusk when they saw something in the trees to their left. People say, we started to hear a sound that sounded like someone moaning. One of the scouts said it was very scary, and the noise kept getting closer. It was clear that more than one thing was coming toward them. Then, they saw what looked like a tall man walking out of the woods and straight across the meadow in front of them. Alex, another scout, says that he didn't look at all like a person. At first, he looked really big, and then his arms looked like they were dragging behind him. Even though we couldn't see his face because it was so dark, we could see his black body. It scared us. It went away into the shadows. After that, the boys went home. The next morning, they went back to look for proof, but they didn't find anything. Even though they saw something that they couldn't explain at night, none of them believed that it was encrypted, Bigfoot, or anything else supernatural. Alex says, I'm not sure what we saw, but I know it wasn't a person and it didn't act like any animal I've ever seen. I feel like my life is against all odds. I thought I knew everything there was to know about animals because I always thought humans were the most dangerous predators. Well, maybe a few things like sharks, bears, lions, and other things were under there, but this day would show me that I was wrong about everything. It would show me that there's something much bigger than humans and anything else that hunts. Actually. Now, I'll tell you about it. So, I was camping with a good friend of mine in Yosemite National Park. We were there for a total of 6 days and nights. Everything went pretty much according to plan. Most of the day, we'd get up, go hiking, come back, eat dinner, relax, and go to bed. This is what we did the whole time. On the 5th day, though, we hiked into a part of the park we had never been to before. We like to go off the path, as we always do. I feel like we're getting to see and do more. Even though many of the park rangers said it was a big no-no, we were more on the risky side and went off the main trails. But what we did probably wasn't safe, but that's what you get when you have 2 young men in their 20s who want to do something crazy. After starting up a small, rocky slope, we were probably 3 or 4 miles from the nearest trail when we saw something very, very scary. Just so you know, as far as I know, nothing in the animal world can do what we saw. But there it was, so it must have been another bear. But as far as I know, bears don't kill other bears in this way. We found a male grizzly bear that had been ripped in half. I don't mean that another bear killed it and ate it. I mean that it was physically torn in half from about the middle. as if a giant had grabbed each end of the bear and ripped it in half. You could see where its mouth had been, and how the flesh was torn and all over the rock. It looked like the bear had no chance at all. My friend and I just stood there, stunned and confused by what we saw. It was really something to see. I don't think we even talked for 23 minutes before we both started walking around to find out what would kill an adult male grizzly bear. It had to be a grown-up man. I mean, this was a very, very big brown bear, so I can't prove it was a grizzly, but I'm pretty sure brown bears don't get this big, and if you look up a grizzly bear online, it seems to match up with the size and everything else. My friend took a closer look at what it was. All the blood and gore made me feel a little bit worse. He has always been more of a thinker, and the way the flesh tore was very interesting to him. He said that it looked like it was done by force, as if something had grabbed it and literally torn the bear in half, the way the skin thins and starts to tear. This looks exactly like that. Another thing he might notice is that the bear had no other wounds. There are no claw marks or other signs of a fight, like blood. It means that it probably wasn't fighting another bear or wolves, since I know they are here, but I also know that wolves were biting at its back legs. There were no signs of bite marks on the back legs, no blood, or anything else that could have been caused by the middle being ripped open. There were also no signs that this bear had been eaten, which means that whatever killed it had not tried to eat it or anything. Just killed it where it stood and walked away. We quickly looked in the 10 to 20 feet around the bear, but there was nothing. The grass wasn't flattened, and there were no signs of a fight or other disturbance. Most of the time, the soil is turned over, making it look like there was some kind of standoff. Nothing. It looks like something big split the spare toward in two. Put it here and then left. There are no tracks, no footprints, nothing. We just sat there in shock, disbelief, and confusion. What are you? Out here, someone is going to kill a grizzly bear, rip it in half without leaving any bite marks and leave it. It looks like the kill happened recently, maybe in the last 12 hours. No flies were flying around it. So I'm not sure if that has anything to do with the date or kill time. It was about lunchtime. Outside, it was about 70. It took us a little longer than usual to get back down to camp. We told a park ranger right away, and they told us they'd go look at it and take care of it. We didn't hear anything else about it, and if we didn't want to, we went on another hike the next day in a different part of the park. That was pretty much the end of that. Then, I still try to guess what killed that bear and why to this day. Nothing makes sense. Nothing makes sense. Like many other traditional North American families, my family and I would try to go camping almost every summer. So, this happened when I was about 14 years old, when I was a teenager. I was with two close friends, and we were all in our own tent. This happened in the Rockefeller State Park Reserve, by the way. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on a backstory or information that doesn't matter. We'll jump right in. On the first night, I woke up to go to the bathroom, so I got out of my tent and stumbled to a tree about 15 feet away, which took me about 2.5 days of sleep and being awake. I pull it out and start pinging. Well, about halfway through my stream, I saw two glowing yellow lights. I'm trying to look at them and figure out what they could be, but I can only see their eyes, and they seem to be swaying back and forth, as if whoever they belong to is drunk. They were maybe 70 feet away and moving slowly toward me. Suddenly, I had a really bad feeling. It made me feel like I was going to die. I'm just feeling sick to my stomach. I cut myself off almost 3/4 of the way up my stream, and I ran back to the tent so fast you might as well call me USD bolts. Surprisingly, my friends didn't wake up. They are as sleepy as rocks. I mean, there could have been a Category 5 hurricane and they would have slept right through it. What I saw scared me so much that I stayed awake for what seemed like hours. No animal is there. I know that's what you mean by that. I was looking at a small meadow not too far away. The eyes were pretty high off the ground. There are about 2 trees there during the day, and we're not too far from Small Link. My problem is that people are denying that it could be a deer or a bear. Is it true that most of the time, for eyes to look like that, light has to be shone into them so that the light reflects and makes it look like that? No light came from any direction. It was not very bright. We did have an LED lantern to my left, but it was probably 30 feet away, and there's no way that it could have made the eyes of whatever animal this was glow that much from almost 100 feet away. I mean, they were glowing in a strange way. It made me think of a prop for Halloween. So that's why it scared me so much, and it was moving slowly towards me. The rest of the night went by without any more events. I finally fell asleep, but not when that was over. I never told my friends or family about it. No one ever told me anything, but I just wanted to tell you about my own scary camping experience. Have a good day and stay safe this month. My sighting happened about halfway between Cody and Yellowstone. My friend and I saw something in the distance staring at us. It was moving very slowly down a slope in an open area. In fact, it was the way the creature moved that caught our attention. As soon as we saw it, we knew it wasn't a person. It was too big, too bulky, and had long hair all over it. The same way a bear walks, except bears don't walk this comfortably when they walk on 2 legs. The gait was also not the same. It was also about 89 feet tall and anywhere from 120 to 150 yards away, if you did the math right. It went from the southwest to the northwest. so we saw its back and part of its side. It looked a lot like the creature in the Patterson and Gimli movie. It was also very long, wide, and built. My cousin is a biologist, and I told him about this experience. He doesn't know exactly what it was. I think he thought about Bigfoot for a short time, but he doesn't believe in it. I think he thinks it's just a bear that was called something else. But I have seen bears and hunted them for years. I know what they do, what they look like, and what they look like when they're walking on two legs. This was not a bear at all. To be honest, it looked like a big person with a big fur coat and a cone-shaped head. No neck at all. They are very wide. I don't want to go off the rails and say this was a Bigfoot, but it was definitely a very interesting sighting. Now, about an hour or two after the sighting, we were still in the area, and in the distance, we heard wood breaking. I almost wonder if whatever this was caused that. I know nothing about Bigfoot at all. But I can't help but think about these two things at the same time. I don't know if this is important, but earlier that day, I heard some elk bugling. After they signed whatever this was, they seemed to stop and be quiet. I went hiking by myself in the great woods. This wasn't in a national forest or anywhere else special, it was just a big section of woods far off the beaten path near my house. Something about going camping by yourself makes you feel so close to nature and at peace. If you love the outdoors like I do, you'll know what I mean. Just then, I started a fire. At this point, it was about 4:45 p.m. Even though I wasn't at my desk yet, I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel someone else nearby, but I couldn't see anyone else. I didn't get the sense that it was something bad. Just someone keeping an eye on me. I heard a branch break, so I went to see what was going on, but I didn't see anyone or anything. I went back to sit by the fire, and it was quiet for a while. I kind of got lost in my own thoughts, which happens to me a lot when I'm in the woods. At 4:55, 55 quickly turned into 6, and 6 quickly turned into 7. The whole time, it was very quiet, and I couldn't get rid of the feeling that someone was looking at me. Even though I checked very carefully, I never saw anyone see eyes or animals nearby. I found it very strange. So, at some point or another, I just decided to go to bed. After I set up my tent, I laid down in my sleeping bag and tried to fall asleep. Forget it all. It was a very awkward night. I didn't have to think about it for long before I realized I wasn't going to sleep. I could still feel and know that something was watching me, so I finally got up and decided to go look for whatever it was, even though nothing seemed strange or out of place. I could feel more than one set of eyes on me as I looked around, or at least that's how it felt now. This lasted only a few seconds, and then I heard what sounded like a very large person running away from me. I was very scared, but I couldn't find anything out of place. After the noise, if it had been a man, I would have seen him walk from left to right. There was no way to know how long this person or thing that I never saw had been watching me. It's a safe bet. I don't think I'll ever be able to sleep as late as I did that night. I'll probably just camp with people I already know, or at least, during the day. Who knows what kind of animal might have been looking at me. We had just set up base camp at the mountain's base. It was almost dark, so we wanted to make sure everything was set up right before it got too dark to see. My cousins who came with me did not know as much about being outside as I did. The whole time, they had been complaining. One of the reasons I was glad this trip was over was that I could finally hear them stop talking. Our camp was set up on a small bluff that was backed by 3 thick brush walls. We could set up a campfire for the night in the right spot in front of our tents. I suggested we go down to a nearby creek so they could cool off. About 30 minutes later, they came back clean and refreshed, or as clean and refreshed as you can get. We talked and joked around the fire for a while, ate snacks, and told stories. You know, the usual things. Then we said our goodbyes, said goodnight, and went into the tent to get ready for bed. It was about 8 or 9 p.m. at this point. I thought I'd take a walk around the camp and see what was going on. As I walked toward the creek, which was about 150 yards from our campsite and where my cousins had washed up earlier, I noticed that it was the same creek. I thought I heard something big moving slowly through the bushes. It didn't sound like a deer or anything else that walks on 4 legs. It seemed like someone was moving very slowly. After making sure it wasn't my cousins playing a joke on me, I moved toward the sounds. As I got closer, I could tell that whoever was making them was going more left to right and not back. As I got closer to the creek bed, I saw what looked like a very big man come out and stand on a big rock next to the stream. He was about to cross it. What I saw had way too much hair and was much too tall and big to be a person. I couldn't see a face because it was so dark, but I could tell by the way it moved and acted. As far as I can tell, it saw me as well as I saw it in the brush, which is now about 30 to 40 feet away. It seemed to be just as shocked as I was when I first saw it. We kind of just stood there and looked at each other before it ran away. This scared me, but I ran back to camp quickly without saying anything and tried my best to forget about it. The next day, I went to my tent and didn't say a word. To get to the river, we had to walk down. There was another spot where we found a lot of blood, fur, and even clothes. Very odd. We chose not to look into it too much. My cousins were already scared, but as we were heading back down the mountain and setting up camp again, I heard something in the woods that stopped us in our tracks. My cousins were now very scared. I just listened to make sure it wasn't just little girls being scared. It started up again, this time with louder screams and trees falling, and it's over much more quickly. I chose to do something this time. And boy, did that get my cousins up and moving. This was enough to make them very scared. So we did a double turn and went back down the mountain into the woods. I don't know for sure what I saw that night or what kind of animal it could have been. But I know for sure that it was neither a bear nor a person in any way. I know for sure that's true. I'm just glad my cousins didn't see it, because the sounds they heard really scared them. I have to say that it scared me, too. In the fall, I still go back to that area to hunt. I haven't heard or seen anything like that since my wife and I were camping in the Indiana State Forest campground. On its own, the day had been great. We already knew a few people in the camp and started a campfire in the pit. After dinner, we all decided to go look around for a while in the woods. We were walking with another couple when we came across the entrance to a cave. Everyone else was interested. So we went inside. It wasn't a very big cavern, but it was fun, and my wife and I like to explore a little bit. She even took pictures of me while I was standing in some of the rooms. Then we went back outside to meet up with everyone else. When we went outside again, we saw that her camera was no longer there. She asked if I had it, but I told her I didn't. We both knew she couldn't have dropped it inside without making a fuss, and none of them had picked it up. The cave didn't have much light, so the only thing I can think of is that they didn't want us to find or see something. Luckily, it was just a cheap Kodak. It wasn't like it was a pricey DSLR or anything, it was just a disposable camera. We just added up our losses and went on with the rest of the evening. With our new friends, we went to a place in the woods where there was a fire pit and made s'mores. After a while, we stopped talking and looked up at the clear sky instead. We said our goodbyes and went to bed after some much-needed conversation. After we went to bed, I got up to go to the bathroom. I walked out of her tent, down the path a few feet, turned around, and saw something standing there, blocking my way to the camping area. Since it wasn't a 6-foot-tall person, it looks like it weighed about 250 pounds. It was a dirty grey color and had long arms and a face and nose that looked like a pig. I was so scared that I couldn't move. It looked at me for about 10 seconds, then turned around and walked away. I tried to wake up my wife so we could get ready to leave, but she had had a lot of wine before bed and was very, very asleep. I spent most of the night awake because I was afraid it would come back. Well, a few days later I told my wife I had seen something in the woods. She told me that she had seen the same thing in the woods at night, and she was walking back to our tent when she told me this. She said that it did nothing but look at her. When it turned around and two of them walked away, she was too afraid to say anything. I can't believe she saw what I saw and didn't think I was crazy. The real question is probably, what did we see? In 2014, in the fall, we camped in the national forest near Hot Springs, Arkansas, with my family. We had been going to this area without any problems for years. The morning after we got to her camp, my husband went out to get firewood while my kids and I hung out at camp and took it easy. My daughter was practicing shooting an arrow and she asked if she could go start a fire by stirring it up. We didn't have to wait for the wood to burn for so long before we could do anything else. She left her bow on a chair by the picnic table, about 30 feet from where I was lying in the hammock between two trees, reading a book while stirring the fire. She thought she heard something walking into the woods and turned to look, but didn't see anything. She went back to the fire, cut up a branch we had brought with us, and started putting it in. When she heard her bow fall, she knew she hadn't touched it since she left to start the fire and put it back where it belonged. This made her even more curious, so she walked over to where she had put it down and found it about 5 feet away from the chair on the ground. She put her arrows back in her bow and walked back to camp. Just as our son came out of the camper to ask if anyone else could hear the strange sounds in the woods, he heard something really, really strange. My daughter told him to go get his bow, so he walked around the camper and picked up both his bow and his compound bow. Now, they were both walking. At this point, I had slowly woken up from my nap and asked everyone where they were going, thinking they were trying to scare me. They both said that they thought the noise in the woods was coming from something close by and that they really wanted to go check it out. I told him that it didn't matter how strange the sound was. They ran back to camp with blank, white faces. They told me we saw it while taking deep breaths. Behind the trees, it looked like a big, hairy man was hiding, which scared them for the rest of the night. They just sat there and did nothing. I can tell they were scared, but neither my husband nor I saw anything. It never went anywhere, thank goodness. A little over 2 years ago, some friends and I went camping near Loveland, Ohio. This state park has been around since the 1930s, when it was built. It is also very far away from other people, at least 3 to 4 miles. Even though it had rained a lot during the week, we decided to camp at night if you drove to the entrance. We put up our tent on one side of a ravine so that if the wind picked up suddenly, we would have somewhere to hide. At first, everything was fine. But as night fell, strange things started happening. Strange sounds would come from far away, and one of my friends was almost sure he heard a scream at 1.1. We were getting a little scared, so we stayed in our tents for most of the night and asked ourselves why we chose this place again. One friend said that he had heard at some point that this place was haunted. Either that, or they had done a lot of satanic cult rituals, which would explain all the creepy sounds and atmosphere. I have no way to back that up, but it would make sense. This camping trip was, to put it mildly, a little scary. At one point, we had to get up and use a nearby tree as a bathroom. When I went outside for the second time, everything felt different. The air was so thick that you could cut it with a knife, and everyone was on edge, as if something could happen at any time. Even though nothing happened, it felt like 1,000 eyes were watching you from everywhere. So we had to go to the bathroom and take turns going first. The night itself went pretty smoothly, thank goodness. The next morning, we packed up and moved to a completely different camping spot. This was a no-go for future events. 2019, I'm sure we all remember fondly the last summer before the pandemic and before everything went weird and crazy. Well, I have a story about going camping with a friend that will probably scare you. This friend and I were looking for adventure, so we decided to climb up a very steep, rocky slope. We had always wanted to go to the top of the ridge and see what was there. I probably don't mean anything exciting, but it is a great view. Once we get to this ridge, which takes about 20 minutes, there is blood everywhere, and I mean everywhere. It looks like something was splattered on the rocks. And I don't mean that there was enough blood to kill and eat an animal up here. I mean that it was easily more than 9 feet wide, and it didn't look that old. Maybe 2 days at most, like there had been a massacre or something up here. But besides the dried blood, there were no clothes, hair for bones, or any other signs that anything had been killed up here. We were pretty scared by what happened. So we decided to climb back down the ranch and go back to camp. We told his parents about it, but they kind of just didn't think much of it. Right? Typical parents. So, the next day, we decided to go back up there. We might want to look into this to see if there's a reason for it. I mean, there was so much dried blood in places where it didn't belong. So we have to climb all the way back up there, which takes about 20 minutes. This time, when we get up there, there's no sign of the blood. It was gone for good. My friend and I are now questioning each other's sanity because we both say we saw this yesterday. Both of us were here. We both saw it happen, and now it looks like the blood was never here. We're a little upset that there's no longer any blood here. So we can't look into what might have caused it. So, we go back down the ridge and tell his parents that the blood is no longer there. They don't believe us at all. They thought we were making it all up to get a rise out of them. You know, get them interested in our story, which we just kind of figured, let's just stop talking to them because they don't believe us at all. Well, the second day goes by, and the third day comes, and we start to think that maybe we should go back up there again to see if there's any sign of where the blood could have gone, since the first 2 days we just went up there and left. We hadn't tried very hard to go up there and look around. Certainly not as much as we should have. So we went back up there and looked around more. This time, instead of a big mess of blood or no blood at all, we saw a small trail of blood. It looks like tiny droplets of blood, as if something or someone was bleeding and walked a short distance. We went where the blood led. This led to a tiny hole in the wall of a cave about 100 feet away. It was kind of hidden because it was on a rocky outcropping. But the hole wasn't very big. If we had to guess, we'd say it was about 3 feet across. And it went down quickly and sharply. You pretty much have to fall into it. We didn't know what was down there, but the blood led us there. We thought it might have been a coyote or something. Was hurt or hurt. This is where it landed when it fell. We didn't have any flashlights, but we wanted to look outside and go further. My friend tells me that we hear something as we listen outside. It sounds like someone is calling out to us. But it sounded like it was coming from an old AM radio box or something. It was all crackly and messed up. It sounded really creepy, and the voice was just crazy. I am inside. Do something for me. It was. I can hear you boys out there saying over and over again, come in here, come in, come inside, come down. Both my friend and I were very scared. So we ran away in the direction of where we first saw blood running down the ridge back to camp. We told his parents again when we got back to the campsite. But of course they didn't believe us and wrote us off. Well, that night was pretty exciting. In the middle of the night, my friend wakes me up by shaking me. We are in a tent of our own. His parents are in the other room, and we can hear them screaming away. Not like any other screams I've ever heard. This sounded like someone was shouting again through a megaphone. It was kind of crackly and distorted, like someone was screaming into a voice box, but there were only two tones. Like hearing two people scream at the same time. And it was coming from the same ridge where we had been 3 days ago. I don't know what it was. We almost ran into. I don't know what was down in that hole. I don't know where the blood went. But all I know is I never want to see it face to face. I would usually go camping with my family just about every spring and summer when I was a kid. All the way to being a teenager. This stopped once I turned 18 and began off to college. We would sometimes go camping 3 times a year if my father could get the time off work, but that was not always possible, at least once a year for sure. So our story takes place in spring of 2015. A little over 3 years ago my father was going to work one morning, and I saw a bright green light in the sky directly above him as he drove along an empty road to get our campsite. He figured it was just a helicopter but realized helicopters don't usually fly at night or before dawn, which is about what would have been from his perspective. The sighting lasted about 20 seconds until he could not see it anymore due to the surrounding homes blocking his view in the thick timber. My dad continued on like nothing else would said. I remember my mom made a comment about aliens, although none of us really believed her well that night. However, as we're setting up our tent, I see the green light in the sky yet again, and I make a comment about it to my parents. They act like it didn't happen right away, and the rest of that camping trip felt very strange. I would sometimes hear what sounded like screams in the distance. I remember sitting there in my chair once. Crofsh & Co., don't judge me because it's something I like to do. And it sounded like an 18-wheeler and a truck collided head-on, maybe 500 feet away from me. I'm just making very simple guesses here. I don't know how far away it was, but it sounded close, and no one else, including my whole family, seemed to notice that I was the only one who heard it. I jumped out of my chair and yelled, "What was that?" because the sound was so loud. "Did you listen to that?" And my whole family looked at me with puzzled faces and wondered if I was going crazy. I did not. I knew I had seen it. So, later that night, when we were making s'mores, I looked up and saw that green light. Again. I tried to show it to my dad, but he didn't pay much attention. Most likely, it's just a helicopter. I don't understand how people can be so stupid and clueless. Well, the rest of that short camping trip was just very tense. I don't want to say it was aliens, but I'm sure we had some kind of interaction with the UFO in the sky. I don't know what that loud crashing sound was, but it was like a ship or something crashing into a tree, even though it didn't sound like the trees were moving from where I was. There's no logical or physical way to explain that sound, and I still don't know why I'm the only one who heard it. I don't know if it was a ghost or something else, but when we got to our camping spot, we set up everything and got ready. We were eating dinner and had just finished making hot dogs and mashed potatoes. If you have to ask, they were instant mashed potatoes. And my wife sees an old-looking man next door who is kind of hunched over. He gives us a smile. He seemed very nice, and then he went back into his camper. Well, we were done with dinner, so we just sat around the fire and talked. When he comes back out, he's acting weird. He moves in a very strange, sort of twitchy, but also robotic way. I told my wife about it at the same time, but she just said, "Well, he must be old." I thought to myself, yeah, maybe he has a health problem. He then comes out from behind his camper and walks toward the other end of the road. This was very strange. Now, here's some info. So, if you turn left from where our campsite was, you can get to where the camp post is. If you go to the right, you'll find another set of restrooms and, I think, a water spigot. At the moment, there aren't that many people in this campground. If you went straight ahead instead of left or right, you'd end up at a smaller lake, and it's getting dark. So we see him leave, but we're not really paying attention to him because we're busy making s'mores and talking to each other. Well, he's been gone for a long time, and I only know this because when he comes back, we realize how long he's been gone. Now, let me tell you why this didn't make sense. I'm going to guess that maybe 30 minutes have passed. I start to see a naked man running toward us toward the darkness. This is because of the angle at which I'm sitting in my chair and where I'm facing, which is directly at his campsite, where his trailer is, and the road that turns right behind me is the road that leads west or towards the camp post at the park's entrance. I'm sitting there talking to my wife, and out of the corner of my eye, I see this naked man running on the road. It draws my attention right away, and when I look, I see that it's the same old man from before, but this time he's running naked. I mean, he's in his birthday suit, and he almost trips and lands on his knees with his hands in the air and starts throwing up a lot of blood. When he started hacking up a lot of money, my wife and I jumped out of our seats and ran towards him to see if he was okay. When he stood up, blood and vomit were all over him, and he seemed almost crazy. He runs away yelling into the woods and toward the lake. Now that he's gone, the only thing we can do is call the camp host and tell him what's going on. We were scared, but we were also very worried about this old man's safety. We can't figure out why he was acting this way. So we quickly got in the car and drove down to the camp post, but they weren't there. So we waited around for me for about 5 or 10 minutes, but the campos didn't come back. We thought we'd try again later, but keep an eye on this old man in the meantime. We get back in the car and drive about a minute back to our campsite. When we get there, his whole camp is gone, no camper, tent, or anything else. And remember that when we first pulled into this camping spot, he already had everything set up. He had his propane tanks out and his awning up. It looked like the guy had been camping there for a long time. There's no way someone could move a camper, a 1/5 wheel, and everything he was carrying in less than 10 minutes. But the campsite was completely empty. There was nothing there, and from what I could see, there was no sign that anyone had been there recently. This really confused and shocked both my wife and me. So we waited for about 30 minutes more. A lot to worry about. 30 more minutes. And remember that the crazy old man didn't show up during this time. So we get back up and go back to where the camp post is, this time driving a little faster. Even though they're probably only about 60 seconds away, we start waving our arms at them and telling them that there's a crazy old naked man running around the campsite who just threw up a lot of blood. Can you now help us? She is scared and looks through her records. No one has been staying in that camp spot for more than 6 weeks. It's been vacant. We just tell her that can't be true. We just got here about an hour ago. There was an old man who seemed to have been there for a long time. She just shook her head and said, "That can't be right, sir. Every night, we go through and check each place to camp. Since weeks ago, nobody has been there." So I told her to come back with me so I could show her where on the road he had thrown up blood. She did it. We walked about 60 feet up the road from our campsite, where he fell to his knees and hands and threw up blood. There was nothing there. There was no blood or bile or anything else. And the road, which was mostly gravel, didn't look like it had been touched in any way. It's as if this old man had never been there. So what you're telling me, is that I should believe that my wife and I just had a dream about him and that he never existed. As if we were living in some kind of different world. I told the woman, and both she and my wife saw him. I told her, "Lady, I know what he was wearing and how he looked. I will explain what happened. There's no reason for me to lie about this." But in the end, she basically said, "I don't know what to tell you. I keep my paper records here, and every night I go through them here. No one has ever come here. I think that by the end of the conversation, she was a little annoyed with me for trying to convince her that someone was here who, based on her records, wasn't. She ended the conversation in a very nice way and wished me a good rest of my camping trip. My wife and I didn't know what to think about it all. We did not lose our minds. We didn't have a history of mental illness on either side of our family. We were also still very young in our late 30s, and we'd never seen things that weren't there or had hallucinations before. We don't drink, smoke, take drugs, or do anything else bad. And this woman is trying to tell me that we just magically saw an old naked man throw up blood all over himself and then run away screaming like a banshee. Okay. And he doesn't seem to be there. And he was able to pack up and move his whole campsite, including his awning and fifth wheel, in less than 10 minutes without disturbing the ground around him. I don't believe it. I thought this was like something from the Twilight Zone. It was the third day of hunting season for deer, and I was going to try my luck in a part of the state where there are a lot of deer. I needed to do it before the season was over. It was snowing a lot, so I had to make sure to leave before it got too late. I parked right outside the park and walked about 30 minutes to get there. I didn't mind that it was snowing lightly and that the snow crunched under my feet. I hadn't seen any deer yet, so I went back to my car to wait for a while before going out again. I got close to my car and saw something. From 50 feet away, a pair of eyes were glowing bright orange. At first, I thought it wasn't a deer because it didn't have the two white dots that deer usually have. When the lights on this figure turned on and it slowly walked toward me, my heart stopped. I had a brief moment of panic and fear, and I almost fell. The figure went away, but I could still hear crunching footsteps coming closer to where I was lying. I could feel my body shutting down from fear, and all I wanted to do was curl up into a ball and disappear. I felt like death was coming soon. I blacked out for about 10 minutes, then got in my car and drove away. I saw this thing when I was 16 years old. Andrew and Cameron, two of my best friends, and I used to go camping together. When this happened, it was summer in Seattle, Washington. It also happened in the daytime. Now, I'm sorry if I forget the creek's name, but I think it was Rock Creek. But I could be wrong no matter what. We stayed there for a few days before going back to our hometowns, since none of us lived in the same place and this is the only time of year to do so. We had to get together as a group. It began in a pretty classy way. We took the wrong trail up the mountain. Given how small it is compared to the other towns in the area, the name is kind of funny. We gave up trying to find the right trail, so we decided to go back instead of setting up camp. We took some alcohol with us. Yes. Parents, Please let us do this on our own. At the time, we were all 16 or 17 years old. Now, where we were on the creek, it was very quiet and there were no trails nearby. We didn't stay on the trail. We were proud young men, so we thought we were better than that. We thought it would be fun to camp, get drunk, and mess around with our flashlights, probably trying to make up stupid ghost stories. We had already had about half of the alcohol we were going to drink for the day, and we were getting pretty hungry. You know what it's like to have the munchies when you're drunk. So we had to go back to where we'd set up camp and get some food and firewood ready. Cameron left to get some kind of food ingredients. Andrew and I stayed behind to start a fire while other people did the same. As it was getting darker outside, I looked up at the sky. We had to move quickly. But I noticed something over the tree, where I thought I saw movement at first. Where I thought the bark was, it started to move, as if someone had painted white on it. I stood there for a moment trying to figure out what I was looking at. It looked like a person or what I thought was a tree, but it was actually a person behind. The tree started to move in a pattern that looked like it was dancing. It wasn't really dancing, but that's the only way I could describe it. I turned quickly to Andrew, and told him what I was seeing. The tree wasn't a tree at all. Instead, it looked like an old woman with her head held up by her long, bony arms. She didn't have a face, eyes, or a mouth, and her grey hair reached her waist. I don't know if Andrew and I saw a demon, a ghost, or something else, but we ran out screaming our heads off. We did not look back. We left the small campsite we had there, ran into Cameron, and told him there was a freaking demon in the woods. We had to get going. He laughed in our faces because he thought we had had too much to drink, but we had only had one drink that day. We had been drinking it all day long. So, since we weren't drunk, we told him, "Screw you, man. You can stay here if you want, but we're leaving." But I think he got scared because we moved away from him a little and he screamed for us not to leave him behind. We never once looked behind us, and even my friends Andrew and Cameron still don't want to talk about what happened that night. No matter what, I always took my dog with me when I camped. I called him Buddy. I know, it's a unique name, right? But none of that mattered. He stood by me through good times and bad. He's the one who made me aware of what I saw this night. While I was camping with him alone in the dark woods, I had just gotten up from the fire I made, which was now just red coals. I was looking for more firewood, but it was hard to see because there was no moon. The only light was from the stars, and I could easily see everything in front of me. I didn't have very good eyesight. So when I saw something move on the other side of the trees, about 200 feet away, I knew there was something there. At first, I didn't think much of it. I thought it could be a bear or a deer. So I stopped moving and waited until one of them came back into view. I might be able to figure out what I was seeing. So that's when I saw this big black shape moving through the woods toward me without making any noise at all. It seemed to just float across and crash into the trees, like it was gliding. I thought it might have been a person, but it looked like a big black trash bag or something. This theme was getting clearer, but from where I was standing, it didn't look like it had much of a shape. It looked like a big black mass floating and bubbling through the air, and then it went away like smoke. I don't know what it was, but it certainly scared me. It was supposed to be just an overnight stay close to where we live. We had arrived there 10 p.m. on a Friday night, October 16th. It was not the best of places for a camping trip, but it was convenient and free after all. So yeah, that wasn't bad either. We had our car parked near a small opening in the trees where two paths met. We set up camp close to the car. It was already fairly dark when I ran out of gas lanterns, so I would go restock in the morning before the sun got too hot. I woke up around 6 a.m. on Saturday. The sun was already high in the sky. We had planned on leaving early to go to my mom's house for breakfast. I treat myself with a good cup of coffee while packing our things in the car. I took another one before leaving. It would be a long drive over an hour and I did not want to get too thirsty. My daughter Stephanie was in the passenger seat and my daughter Ashley in the back as we're driving towards my mother's house, coming out of the corner with another car on the road ahead of me. It seems that it had been forced off the road and was resting in a ditch. We slowed down, kept our eyes in the car since we were so close to it. Strangely, we didn't hear any engine noise or see any exhaust coming from it. That's when I noticed there was nobody around. The driver door should have been wide open due to the ditch it was in, but there were no broken windows. There was nothing that could have stopped the noise of this car's engine. Now my kids began looking around too, looking for the driver who just abandoned their vehicle. There were also no emergency vehicles present. We all at the same time saw something very peculiar hanging from a tree to our right. A large animal, brown in color, with a hairy face and big black eyes looking at us. It was not a bear, it wasn't a deer, it did not look like any kind of animal I had ever seen before. It took off immediately from the tree, it was on jumped to another one and it took off running on the other side of the woods. We had never heard of a thing before. It looked like some kind of large ape, but definitely not an orangutan. Maybe we would have been braver if it had been daytime. We could see more things around us. Maybe somebody would have believed what we saw. I'm still amazed by this and can hardly believe it. We were not daydreaming. My kids saw the same thing I did and we all agree on what we saw. This is when we had just come back from camping. Actually, I just went solo with my mom, and because the camping trip was easily 3 hours away from where we lived, it took quite the drive to get home, and so now we're driving later on at night, maybe about 1015, if I remember correctly. And off to my side of the road, which I'm in the passenger side seat, my mom is driving. We're just having conversation and I see this tall white Nike figure quickly dart into the trees on the right side. It freaks me out, but I don't bother to mention anything to my mother. Of course I know she'll just ridicule me like she always does, accuse me of it being my imagination. As soon as we drove past the area, this thing steps out onto the road and my mother and I both get a full frontal view of this thing. There's no mistaking what it was something from another dimension or so. I feel my mom starts screaming and flooring the car. This thing dives out of the way and my mom is now doing 70 miles per hour on a road that you're only supposed to be doing 45. I try to calm her down, but she tells me to shut up, and so I just sit back in the car and not say anything. So we fly home in like 40 minutes versus an hour. My mom does not say a word the rest of the night, nor did she say a word the rest of the drive home. I have no idea how to explain what it is that I saw. However, after trying to get online and do some research myself, I'm convinced that what my mother and I saw was either one of three things: a bear, which I don't think it's very likely judging by the figure, its stature and its coloration. I mean, what was the four? It was not a bear number to an alien. Well, this seems the most plausible. It's still hard for me to even recognize as an option. And of course number 3, Bigfoot again, like number 1, I don't think it really works, aren't. Bigfoot's supposed to be hairy. I mean, this was lanky and hairless and its skin was white and pale and dead looking. Pretty sure that's not what Bigfoot looks like. I did not get a good chance to look at its face and I'm glad I didn't. I'm not sure it's something I would want to look at. I'm 35 now. This was when I was a kid, maybe 12 or 13. I used to hang out all the time with this neighborhood kid. He kind of had a very troubled home life, so I won't really get into that. But I think his parents were pretty abusive for a segment of time there. Him and I used to play many afternoons together, and a lot of times it involved us getting into mischief, smoking cigarettes and even going back far into the woods, finding things and looking for stuff to make spears and things with. We built forts, we made makeshift weapons, the stuff that 12, 13-year-old boys usually do. But I can remember one time in particular that we found this old abandoned cabin, our house, whatever you want to call it, that really sent a scare down our spines. I remember it was summertime, and he started telling me about how there's supposedly this haunted cabin that goes far in the woods. I guess it used to be a house that was abandoned by a long time ago. I don't really remember all the details. And so, me being 12 and 13, I thought that was just the coolest thing in the world. So I asked him to take me to it, but he told me I needed to be very careful. There's a demon that lives in the house, and if you get too close it'll come out, pull you in and eat your flesh. I ate up every bit of information he was telling me. So we walked probably maybe no more than 2 miles back. I don't really remember, but I remember we had to walk along a creek and find a place where the edge to edge was more shallow so we can get over. This took a little bit of time, and every time I keep asking him how much further, he would just keep saying the same thing. It's not much farther now. It's right up ahead. Well, we finally came to it, and it did look like an old one-story house or cabin just casually put right here in the middle of the forest. But there were no doors, no windows. It looked in pretty bad condition. I wouldn't say it was entirely dilapidated, but it had definitely seen better days. But one thing that really made me feel creepy about the whole thing was how dark the house was. It was no later than 2 or 3 p.m. in the afternoon. And so why is the house this dark? We stood from afar just watching the house, and he was telling me about it. How the demon lives in there, and anybody who wanders back in here, it'll take them. Then he did. What most 13-year-old boys do dared me to go inside. Of course I was also pumped full of adrenaline and freaked out. I refused to. Then he started doing the usual. What's wrong? Are you a chicken? And so me puffing out my chest and pretending I was brave for about 5 seconds. I said, you know what? I know I can do this. And so I promptly stood my ground and I walked right up to that old house. Now I got within probably about 10 feet from the front door, well, or what used to be the door, I should say the entryway, where it was pitch black inside, and I got almost right up to the door, what sounded like an incredibly large glass foss shatter all over a wooden floor. It sent me screaming and running as fast as I could. Even Chuck's face was wide-eyed and kind of pale, if I remember. And he ran after with me back to our houses and he just kept saying over and over, the demon's real, the demon's real, there's really something in there. And well, after that we did not end up going back, but in hindsight, with the ability to look back on this as an adult, it's not like there was this old, creepy abandoned house in the middle of the woods, making it for a perfect haunted house story. I think this was just an old development from long ago, even though it was a ways back into the woods with no other development around it, which I did find odd, but it wasn't so far out of the way that nobody would go back there. I could have very easily seen a homeless person living in it, or maybe an animal, maybe a squatter. It was still a structure and would still provide adequate coverage for weather or cold temperatures if you had your sleeping bag set up in there. Now, do I believe it was a demon or a ghost in there that shattered that glass? I don't. Maybe it was a person in there. Maybe it was coincidence that something had fallen. Whatever it was, I don't know, but 13-year-old me seemed to think it was a demon. The memory, of course, is still creepy, and I've not gone back there ever since that day, but it would be interesting to go back there now just to see what really became of it. And Chuck. He ended up moving about 2 years later after this. Right when I started high school. I've not had contact with him since. I have no idea what he's up to or if he's even alive recently. I thought I would go out after dark and traverse the night landscape looking for anything interesting and unusual. And you bet I found it, just that what I actually came across is a little bit more on the frightening side of things. I don't know how else to describe this creature. but I came across some sort of large bear-looking creature ripping apart the carcass of a deer. I came down to a small creek and heard a noise. I followed that noise. All I had with me was my army knife and my crossbow. Not much, but enough to take down a large predator if need be. And as I approached the noise I spotted it, this large shape that looked like a bear that was eating and ripping apart the flesh of this dead deer. And then it stood up and began using its hands the way a person would. That's when I realized I was not just watching a bear eat something, but rather an unidentified predator that I had no idea what I was dealing with. I took the loudest scope you could and slowly began backing away. The creature stopped, instantly froze and began lifting its head in the air to sniff, doing the usual. And I thought to myself, no, it smells me. It knows I'm here. But then it just casually went back down to what it was doing, digging into the flesh of this dead deer. I used that as my opportunity to turn around as quietly as I can and head back the way I came. There was nothing for me here and I was certainly not gonna be caught by that thing. I normally camp all over the Pacific Northwest and this night was no different. I was camping up in Washington State, Romania County to be exact, actually right at the Hemlock State Park and Wind River Work Center. I was with my wife and we were walking back along the water. This is right around 8 p.m. in 2016. We had just been talking. We had been going through a very stressful portion of our marriage and we were looking for camping as a way to kind of cure that. When we spent time together out of nature, it seemed to diffuse the heated arguments and all the stress of life. But my wife and I both saw something. We're not exactly sure how to explain or put into words. She noticed at first and pointed. There is this large black shape right by the wood line. It appeared to be more of an apparition than anything. It was solid black, moving, very robotically, not coming out of the wood line, but more so moving through the trees in the timber while its movement seemed very robotic. It kind of glided the way its legs moved. Do not match the movement of somebody or something walking bipedally over the branches and ground. It looked very odd and my wife and I began to get a very bad feeling. Just looking at this thing. We knew whatever it was could not mean anything good. We decided now is a good time to get back to our camper. When we got back we talked about it for an hour and that's when all the crickets around us went quiet. So we sat in our camper and sat tight. But the rest of that night we heard some pretty strange sounds that really scared us. At one point after all the crickets had gone silent, we could have sworn that we both heard this really heavy raspy breathing right outside the camper. And it moved from the south, all the way around to the north part of our camper and they just went quiet. It sounded like somebody who smoked heavily. Very deep, very raspy. The raspy breaths also sounded like they came from a very large set of lungs. My wife was horrified and hid in the bedroom the entire time. If anything happened, I was willing to be the protective husband and stand my ground. But I prayed and prayed I did not have to. There's no way I would match whatever could be out there. This was certainly not a bear. Bears don't do what this does. I wish I had an explanation for what it is I encountered. Thanks for listening. It was 1983 and I was in High Point State Park, New Jersey. It was actually in July. I was 26 at the time and right around a very small lake. In fact, I wasn't even that far away from the access road that went around the lake. My camping adventure started off pretty normal, as it usually did. I sat in my tent, got all my supplies together and just sat there enjoying the silence, no chaos, nothing. There's nothing more perfect than hearing the sounds of nature and silence. It's like it's where we're meant to be. No noise, no city life, no hustling or bustling, no people talking. It really doesn't get much better than that. Then I began to hear a noise that I thought was a moose. At first, shows how little I know about moose. It was a noise I could not quite put my finger on, but it sounded very weird, like teeth chattering, but more of a clicking quality to it. I know that's a terrible description, but I have a really hard time pinpointing it, but the chattering or chattering went away. After some time I went to bed. The next day I decided to hike around and I could have sworn I came across a skull of a human, or so I thought it was. It was only part of a fragment, and it freaked me out. I don't know what it could have been, so I quickly threw it down, and dismissed it altogether. I wanted no part to play if that was really the case. It already left a very bad taste in my mouth, metaphorically speaking. I decided to spend the rest of the evening back at camp, maybe reading a good book and getting lost, and that it was about 7 or 8 p.m. My fire was still going and it was starting to get pretty dusky out. Not quite dark just yet. I heard this loud scream like I have never heard from the woods before. It sounded like a wolf howl, but very, very deep, very guttural. Whatever made it had a lot of bass in its voice that was more than enough for me. I stayed that night but tightly gripped my .38 pistol, ready for anything that was going to happen. The night itself remained very quiet, as if you can hear a pin drop. I was ready for just about anything. Within about an hour's time, a very, very bad storm came in, and it poured and poured until about 3 or 4 in the morning. Well, I get up the very next day, which I somehow managed to sleep through everything, and there were these massive tracks all around my campsite leading up into the upper portion of the trees. I did not have any way to measure them, but they were longer than 12 feet, that's for sure. And you could see the indents in the wet mud where it had claws. Something very big with the stride of over 3 foot with clones was walking around bipedally around my tent last night, sometime either during the storm right after, and judging by the way they looked, it had to have been right after it stopped raining, so probably 3 or 4. I kept waking up off and on because the rain would decrease and increase the sound of the pitter-pattering while relaxing. Too many kept stirring me out of a light sleep. I never felt anything weird or scary, like I was being watched or stalked or potentially hunted, to this day. It stands out as easily one of the creepiest outdoors camping experiences I've ever had, and I've had many since then, but none like that.